Welcome to Life Stories, where one woman lost the love of her life and discovered the people she trusted most had been waiting for that moment to strike. Imagine burying your husband, only to be asked, on the very same day, how much his life insurance is worth. This is not just a story about grief. It's about betrayal dressed as family. About an 8-year-old girl who stood taller than the adults in her life, and about the quiet power of saying no when the world expects you to stay silent. If you've ever felt alone in your darkest hour or questioned whether blood truly defines family, this story will hit you where it hurts and where it heals. Take a breath, hold tight, and follow Madeline and Zoe through a journey of love, loss, and a truth no one saw coming. Let's begin. The coffee had gone cold in Madeline Carter's hands, untouched since she'd poured it nearly 2 hours ago. It sat there, forgotten, a dark mirror to the sky outside, overcast and suffocating. From her kitchen window, Seattle looked as it always did in March, moody, damp, timeless. But time had stopped for Madeline last Tuesday at 11:23 a.m. That was when Ethan died. It hadn't been some tragic car accident, no freak accident in a rainstorm. It was quieter than that, quicker. A heart attack in the middle of a client meeting. The paramedics said he collapsed mid-sentence, a coffee cup still warm in his hand. By the time Madeline got to the hospital, he was gone. The man who once made her laugh until her ribs hurt, who read bedtime stories with character voices, who kissed her shoulder every morning before his run, now lay beneath a sheet, his skin still warm, his chest still. She hadn't cried at first. That came later. What she remembered most from that moment was how wrong it looked. Ethan didn't belong in that room, in that stillness. He belonged in the middle of chaos, laughing, talking with his hands, holding their daughter Zoe on his shoulders. The doctor had used words like massive and instant, words that sounded clinical and final, like a verdict. But the real collapse came later that night. Zoe had refused to sleep in her room. She curled into Madeline's side, clutching Ethan's hoodie like a lifeline. Her little body trembled and her voice broke when she whispered, "Is Daddy just gone? Forever?" And Madeline, who always had answers, who solved crises at work and found lost toys in seconds, could only cry and nod. Still, she held on to the idea that at the very least, her family would rally, that her parents, Ronald and Deborah, would arrive with casseroles and blankets and quiet strength. But when she'd called her mother that morning, choking on sobs, her mother had sighed and said, "Can this wait until tomorrow? We're at Emily's birthday dinner. You know how she is." Emily, her older sister. The favorite. Madeline had hung up, stared at the phone for a long time, and realized something she should have known years ago. Blood doesn't always mean family. The days that followed were a haze of condolences, paperwork, and trying to hold herself together for Zoe. Ethan's co-workers had been more comforting than her own flesh and blood. Jenna, his assistant, came by with groceries. Her neighbor Denise cooked for 3 days straight. Even Ethan's college roommate, who Madeline hadn't seen in years, flew in from Portland. But from her own parents, silence, until they came knocking. It was a Thursday. Zoe was at school, and Madeline was sorting through Ethan's neatly labeled files in the home office. That's when she saw it, an envelope. Her name in Ethan's handwriting, sealed with careful precision. Her hands shook as she opened it. "If you're reading this, it means the doctor was right, and I'm so sorry I didn't tell you." The letter went on to explain that Ethan had updated everything, his will, his accounts, even set up a trust for Zoe that couldn't be touched until she was 25. He'd thought of everything. And then the twist. "Your father approached me twice in the past year asking for investment help. I said no. He'll likely come to you now. Please protect what's meant for Zoe." Madeline's breath left her body like she'd been punched. It wasn't grief this time. It was rage. And that night, her father called. "Your mother and I would like to talk. Sunday." "Bring Zoe," he said, as if it were a dinner invitation. Sunday came with the kind of blue sky Seattle rarely offered. Madeline almost laughed at the irony. She and Zoe drove to the house she'd grown up in, the one that smelled like lavender and old carpet, and walked into a living room full of relatives. Emily was there, predictably smug. Her uncles and aunts too, most of whom had avoided eye contact at the funeral. Her father stood in the middle of the room, holding a printed sheet of paper like a contract. "We think, given everything, that a fair split of Ethan's policy would be 50% to us, 15% to Emily. The rest is yours, of course." Madeline stared at him. "You're asking for 65% of the money Ethan left for his daughter?" "It's not just about money," Deborah chimed in. "It's about family, legacy. We supported you for years. You owe us." Madeline opened her mouth to speak, but it was Zoe who stepped forward. "I made something," she said quietly, pulling a folded piece of paper from her backpack. She handed it to her grandfather. "It's a bill for love." Silence blanketed the room. Madeline looked over his shoulder and saw Zoe's childlike scrawl. "Hugging mommy when daddy died, not provided. Helping me when I cried, $0, not provided. Being real grandparents, priceless, not earned." Then at the bottom, total owed. Ronald's hands trembled, Deborah's face fell, Emily's smirk disappeared. And for the first time, Madeline didn't feel like the child in that house. She was the protector now. Have you ever had to choose between loyalty to family and protecting what truly matters? Would you forgive someone who tried to profit from your pain? Because Madeline just did the one thing her parents never expected. She said no. And that no was only the beginning. Madeline didn't cry in the car. She gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, her knuckles bone white, while Zoe sat in the passenger seat, silent, staring straight ahead. The paper she'd handed her grandfather lay folded in Zoe's lap, like a quiet revolution, still warm from her hands. Only once they were home, with the door locked behind them, did Madeline collapse against the wall and slide to the floor. It wasn't the confrontation that broke her. It wasn't even the audacity of her parents' demands. It was Zoe. Zoe had seen through the manipulation, the veiled entitlement, the carefully rehearsed family performance, and she'd called it out, with crayons and construction paper. Madeline had spent her entire life shrinking to fit into a family that made her feel like a second choice. And her daughter, at just 8 years old, had chosen clarity over compliance. And that clarity had consequences. The next morning, Madeline's phone buzzed endlessly. Texts from her mother, voicemails from her father, emails from Emily with subject lines like, "We need to talk." But Madeline didn't need to talk. She needed space. And so she blocked them all, one by one, until her phone was finally silent. For the first time in years, she could hear herself think. But the quiet didn't last. On Thursday, Madeline returned from the grocery store to find a manila envelope slid halfway under her front door. It wasn't from her parents, it was from their lawyer. Inside was a typed letter, cold and precise, stating that Ronald and Deborah Carter intended to challenge the terms of Ethan's will on the grounds of undue influence and unfair distribution. She read it twice, then 3 more times. Her mouth went dry. They weren't just trying to guilt her anymore. They were trying to take her to court. Zoe was in the living room watching cartoons, blissfully unaware. Madeline walked into the kitchen and stared at the letter spread out on the counter. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but fury. It was one thing to be cruel. It was another to be calculated. And this was a calculation. She called Greg, Ethan's lawyer and longtime friend, and read the letter aloud to him. "They don't have a leg to stand on," he said without hesitation. "Ethan's will is airtight. I made sure of it." "But can they drag this into court anyway?" she asked, her voice taut. "They can file. Anyone can. But they'd lose, fast and publicly." She thanked him and hung up, but the knot in her stomach didn't ease. This wasn't about money. Not really. It was about control. It was about her parents reclaiming the upper hand, because they couldn't stand that she was no longer the daughter who said yes, who kept the peace, who bit her tongue while Emily got the spotlight. Now she was the woman who said no, and that made her dangerous. That night, after Zoe fell asleep, Madeline sat at Ethan's desk with a cup of tea and opened his files again. His handwriting stared back at her, organized, meticulous, gentle. In the middle of the folder, labeled Zoe, Future, was a letter she hadn't seen before. Not to her, to Zoe. She read it in one breathless rush, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Ethan had written to their daughter about everything, from his favorite memories of her as a baby to the way she wrinkled her nose when she was curious. But near the end, he wrote something that stopped her heart. "If something ever happens to me, don't let anyone make your mom feel small. She's stronger than she knows, and she's going to move mountains for you. Trust her. Always." Madeline stared at the letter for a long time, as if it were some kind of map, not to where she was going, but to who she needed to be. The next morning, she filed a counter notice with Greg, authorizing him to respond to her parents' legal threat in full. She also added a formal request for a protective injunction to prevent them from contacting Zoe directly through school or otherwise. That afternoon, Zoe came home with a drawing she'd made in art class, a picture of their family. Just the two of them. Her and Madeline, holding hands. Behind them stood a tall tree, its roots wrapped around a stone that read, "Dad. It's us," she said softly. "And him. Always him." Madeline knelt beside her and hugged her tightly. She didn't say, "I'll protect you." She didn't have to. But even as she held her daughter, her mind churned, because something still didn't add up. Why had her parents been so confident? Why the certainty? The numbers in Ethan's will weren't public. No one besides Greg and her had access, unless someone else had been feeding them information. Someone closer than she'd ever suspected. What would you do if you discovered someone you trusted might be the one betraying you? Because Madeline is about to uncover a truth that could change everything. And this time, it's coming from inside her home. The house was quiet, unnervingly so. Zoe was asleep, curled into the blanket fort she'd built in the corner of the living room, and the only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustle of trees outside. Madeline sat in Ethan's old reading chair, the one he'd insisted on keeping, despite its worn armrests. She ran her fingers along the fabric absent-mindedly, replaying the last few weeks over and over like a looped tape that refused to stop. Her parents had filed, just as they'd threatened. Greg had countered swiftly, and the court had dismissed the claim within days. It wasn't a victory that brought celebration, it brought exhaustion. Emotional, spiritual, the kind that made you question how you ever called those people family. But it wasn't the lawsuit that kept her up tonight. It was the phone call. Earlier that afternoon, Madeline had received a voicemail from her neighbor Denise. "I don't know if it means anything," she'd said, her voice low and cautious. "But I saw Emily coming out of your garage last week. She looked nervous. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I thought you should know." Emily. Madeline's sister. The golden one. The artist who never paid rent, the daughter who could do no wrong. She hadn't even considered Emily. It made sense now. The timing, the access, the details her parents should never have known. Emily still had a spare key. From before. From back when Madeline believed there was still something sacred in family. Her breath caught in her throat as she stood, walked down the hall, and opened the garage. Everything looked untouched. The cabinets, the bike rack, the storage bins labeled Xmas and Zoe. And then she saw it. The small fire-safe box Ethan had kept his documents in, tucked behind a shelf. The lock had been scratched. She sank to the floor. Not from shock. From the weight of another betrayal, folding into her chest, like too many bricks stacked on a bridge. Madeline had grown up thinking love was something you earned by being useful, by being quiet, by not making waves. And Ethan, he'd unlearned her, taught her that love didn't have to be bartered or begged for. He'd shown her that protection didn't mean control. And now the people who raised her had weaponized grief, had turned Ethan's death into leverage. She stood up slowly, her fingers still trembling. A decision hardened in her chest like stone. She called Emily. No voicemail, no delay. Her sister answered on the second ring. "I know," Madeline said, voice low and even. "You gave them access, you let them in." Silence. Then, "Maddie, I thought it was just paperwork. Dad said they were helping you. He said they were stealing from Zoe, from Ethan, from me." A long, jagged breath on the other end. "I didn't know what they were planning, I swear. I didn't think they'd actually—" "Of course you didn't. You never think. You just exist in the safety net the rest of us bleed to hold up." "Maddie." Madeline's voice cracked. I can forgive a lot, Emily, but you knew where I kept Ethan's letters, his trust files. You knew, and you said nothing. There was no yelling, no accusation, just grief. And maybe that was worse. Do you want me to come over? Emily asked after a moment. Her voice was small, and for the first time unsure. Madeline paused. She could hear Zoe's soft breathing in the other room. The child who had stood in front of a room full of adults and spoken truth with crayons and courage. No, she said quietly. I want you to understand why you're not welcome here anymore. Not until you learn what loyalty really means. She hung up. Later that night, Madeline lit a candle in the kitchen, not for ceremony, for Ethan. She opened the last drawer in his file cabinet, the one labeled Letters, and pulled out a small notebook he'd kept over the years, lists of memories, advice for Zoe, things he never got to say. She flipped to a page marked with a paperclip. Don't let them make you bitter, Mads. Guard your heart, yes, but don't turn it to stone. Zoe's watching. Show her what strength really looks like. Not the loud kind, the quiet, steady kind. Like love that doesn't give up even when it hurts. Madeline pressed the page to her heart. She couldn't erase what had happened. She couldn't rewrite her family's betrayal. But she could choose what came next. In the morning, she took Zoe to the lake, their lake. The one Ethan had loved most. They sat on the same bench they used to, the woods still weathered, still theirs. Zoe brought 2 rocks, one painted with Ethan's name, the other with a drawing of their house. What's this one for? Madeline asked, touching the painted house. Zoe shrugged, so he remembers where to visit us. Madeline bit back tears. I think he knows. They sat in silence as the sun slipped behind the trees. It was the kind of quiet that didn't ache, the kind that held them gently. Later they scattered petals into the water, each one a memory, each one a goodbye that didn't have to be final. Madeline didn't know what the future held, but she knew this. She and Zoe were enough. Their little family, broken, mended, reborn, was strong in a way the old one had never been. And sometimes, survival is the best kind of revenge. What part of Madeline and Zoe's journey spoke to you the most? And why? Comment 100 if this story touched your heart. Tell us what country you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that love, not blood, defines family. Thank you for watching Life Stories.